Okay, let's begin. Hello, folks. Okay, welcome to the 15th annual workshop on the Energy Efficient HPC Working Group. On behalf of Torsten and the rest of the EHPC Workshop Committee, I'd like to welcome you all. I'm Jana from Intel. This is day 2 of the virtual event. The link to the workshop event is in the chat box that I'm dropping right now. The site should include the agenda, session abstract, bios, and after this event, the presentation materials will also be uploaded there. And this workshop is organized by the Energy Efficient HPC Working Group. And the website for that is on this page as well. Okay, a few etiquettes, just like yesterday. A reminder, questions and answers to be, please submit them in the chat box, the chat icon there. Do not please submit your questions and comments using the Q&A button because that section is not being monitored. And again, I'd like to request the session moderators, leaders, and speakers to please keep monitoring the chat box for incoming comments and questions. A quick overview of the agenda here. We have 2 invited talks. We are very fortunate to have 2 distinguished speakers with us. One talking about large-scale sustainable systems, and the other on policies and technologies surrounding sustainability and AI. And between the 2 invited talks, we also have inserted a very interactive audience-driven session. So we would like to encourage attendees to please participate in that event on advanced facility cooling controls. And with that, if Michael Ott is on the line, I'd like to invite Michael Ott to introduce our speaker, Andrew Chien.
Okay, thank you, Sid. Yeah, so it's my pleasure to announce the first invited talk we have for today, which will be given by Professor Andrew Chien. So Andrew is the William Eckert Distinguished Searles Professor at the University of Chicago, also the director of the Searles Center for Unstoppable Computing, and a senior computer scientist at the Argonne National Laboratory. He received a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering and a Master of Science and PhD in Computer Science from MIT. He serves as an advisor for the NSF Computing, Information Science and Engineering Directorate, and also for the DARPA Information Science and Technology Study Group. And he's going to talk a bit today about how to lead an HPC in the next decade in terms of cost and sustainability. So with that, I would hand over to you, Andrew. Floor is all yours.
Thanks, Michael. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, let me share. Are you guys seeing that?
Yes.
So I want to thank the organizers, Michael and Natalie, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. If I say anything that seems a bit like I'm stumbling over my words, I apologize. I just flew from Europe yesterday, so I've been running around a little bit, but I'm very happy to be able to come and participate in the workshop. Let me move my Zoom boxes out of the way here. So I'm going to talk about a bit of a collection of different things that we've been working on for the last couple of years here at U Chicago. Hopefully a little bit different than what you may have heard me talk about before. So pay attention, I hope. I'm going to talk a little bit about the setup for this, which is why we're also worried about power and sustainability for large-scale computing systems. And then I'll talk about what we've been developing as a strategy to build large-scale computing systems on into the next decade, which of course involves acquiring large quantities of power And we have to add to that the AI challenge, which I understand you're going to have a speaker about this afternoon. And a strategy of building dynamic data centers and systems. We have some recent results on that I'll talk a little bit about. And then I'll talk about a study we've been doing in partnership with the Riken team in Japan about what you might do with the Fugaku-like system in the next generation, exploiting these kinds of techniques. So I'll talk about some preliminary results from that. And I won't get much of a chance to talk about what you may have heard me talk about many times in the past, which is how to make large adaptive loads play nice with the power grid. So I'll just cover that in passing. So with that, let me dive in. Are you guys still hearing me okay? I'm feeling a little bit hoarse here.
Yeah, all good.
Okay. So if you look at what's been going on with leadership HPC systems computing power, it's been a fairly predictable, actually, increase in computing power, which is a surprise considering how many dueling exponentials there are. When we put this plot together back in 2018, and then if you add on top of it the recent system since then, Fugaku at about 20 megawatts, Frontier at about the same level, Aurora at about 50 megawatts, we're really on this very nice exponential curve, which is about 200x performance every 5 years and a 3x power increase, which means that if we're looking at 2027 or looking out at another 5 years beyond that, 2032, you're looking at extremely large quantities of power. So unless something miraculous happens in the hardware technology side, leadership class systems are going to be several hundred megawatts within the decade. So in order to lead, we're going to need access to large amounts of power. The problem with this is that from a TCO point of view, that large amount of power radically shifts the balance of a nominal $500 million CapEx computer system dramatically. 500 million was chosen because that's the nominal estimate for the ECP exascale systems in the US. If you add together NRE and all kinds of other purchase price and so on. The TCO for these systems starting in 2023 looks something like this. The blue thing is mostly CapEx and the OpEx is only about 35%. But if you dial forward 5 years and you look at an 8-year lifetime, the increase in power means that the power cost is likely to become dominant. It's up to 51%. Can you guys see my mouse?
Yes, we can.
Oh, perfect. Okay. So 51%, and if you go to 2032, it's even more. So the problem is that that's a historic shift in the way we think about purchasing systems and operating them in terms of cost balance. So we'd very much like to get back to paying mostly for hardware, not mostly for power. And of course, so on. So the way we coined this HPC leadership challenge is that we need to find a way to acquire large quantities of power at very low cost. And we also need, of course, if we're going to be sustainable, is those large quantities of power must be low carbon, because we certainly don't want the negative carbon emissions impact of our computing systems to grow in proportion to that quantity of power. So the way I like to talk about this is that the road to the future for leadership in HPC is both windy as in this picture winds back and forth, but it's windy, of course, as in renewables, and it's green if we're going to make it there. So that's the setup, if you will. So we need to acquire large quantities of power, low cost and green. We need to build dynamic data centers and systems, as you'll see, as a requirement to exploit that power. And we also need to worry about water use because that's an increasing problem. And then the way we're going to achieve this is by operating flexibly with flexible workloads, flexible times, and perhaps flexible location. And of course, all of this has to play nice with the power grid, because as we've all been seeing over the last 1 year, or if you've been paying close attention over the last 5 years, the power grid has lots of its own problems having to do with reliability and the incorporation of renewable energy and so on. And if we're serious about driving to zero carbon power grids, they have massive problems to solve by themselves. They don't have time to pander to data centers, be they from HPC or from the cloud computing companies. So why are we in this bind? There's this big misnomer that's been bandied around in the community that data center power is not a problem in the grid. So there's a very nice paper written by Eric Massenet and colleagues at LBL. There's a little background noise. At LBL in 2020, that estimated that the data center power use was not increasing much over the prior decade. But in fact, if you look deep inside of that, you would have found that the hyperscale power was increasing dramatically. And this is the hyperscale power increase, both from renewable purchases and projected from and the part on the left is from the Massenet report. In fact, hyperscale folks were growing at 30% CAGR. And I think if you look at the HPC folks, you'll find the same thing is true. Of course, we projected that hyperscale growth back in 2021. And now we realize, of course, we're not on that curve at all. We're actually on a much steeper curve that is, starting as of a year or two ago, massive growth that's cloud and AI, and HPC, if it includes AI, is also on that kind of a growth curve. So that's the difficulty, right? We have a dramatic increase in the power growth rate, which was already exponential to begin with. So what can we do about this? Well, if you read the papers, data centers are considered a key part of the problem. There's been a lot of press about that the data center growth is consuming all of the additional capacity in the grid. AI is accelerating this. Now there's some popular resistance to this, where citizens in certain areas are complaining or agitating or upset, perhaps rightly so, that this dramatic growth is actually impacting them in terms of they're being asked to bankroll the costs and the infrastructure costs. And they may also be, as we've seen in studies, impacted negatively in terms of pricing by the behavior of these data centers. And then, of course, there's crypto mining, which is happening at large scale in places like Texas and the West. The big challenge is that we haven't been expecting such a large growth. So the power grid hasn't built out the infrastructure, and now all of a sudden it comes, and we have a mismatch in planning horizon. So we've been studying this problem, and we've been trying to answer the question of, do we actually have a power grid shortage, and what can we do about it? We studied a bunch of the power grids that are data center popular, let's say, one of which is the power grid in Ireland. What we've found by studying the EIR grid, which is the Ireland power grid, is that if you do a projection based on cloud demand, that was our prior projection as shown in brown here, and then you add to that the expected increase in growth rate due to AI demand, what you do is you will wind up shifting from the green region, which is the feasible, reliable, planned capacity of this grid, to an unsupportable range where you can no longer achieve the reliability that is expected. So a few parameters to explain what's going on here. In the Ireland grid, data centers are already 16% of the power grid capacity. And the grid projected cloud data center CAGR before the AI tsunami hit us was about 10% a year. And the CAGR for AI plus cloud data centers is about 6% higher, based on a projection based on NVIDIA sales rates and distribution into the data center power grids around the world, accelerating it dramatically. 10 to 16 may not sound like a lot, but when it's exponential, it's a huge increase in the growth rate. This green and the pink areas are computed based on the way power grids do reliability, which is something called LOLE that I'll talk about more in a minute, but basically it's an availability guarantee that the power grid gives. And what you can see is that in the Ireland power grid, they would have been out of capacity by 2025 due to some transmission shifts. The addition of the AI growth rate causes this limit to shift into 2024. So our conclusion is, yes, there's a problem. And this is confirmed by the fact that large-scale cloud data centers are being told you cannot attach in Ireland as of last year, actually. So let's see if it's true that there really isn't power in these power grids. It turns out it's a complicated way that power grids actually do this kind of assessment. One possible solution is to change the way they do this, that is to relax power reliability guarantees for new data centers. So the idea is that if you could do this, you could safely attach more data center load to the grid without harming the grid's LOLE or reliability. So let's consider three different guarantees. The first we'll call reliable, which is the traditional guarantee is that you always receive the specified level of power at the LOLE guaranteed rate. That would be as shown here on the right. You have power available for the new data centers as shown in red, and you give guarantees up to the minimum that you'll ever be able to provide, and you'll call that reliable. The second is 80% reliable, which is that you always receive at least 80% of the specified level of power, but you take some risk and you overcommit, right? Over provision, if you will, the power grid, and so on. And then the third, which is the most aggressive, is let's just say you don't guarantee any reliability, that you may have outages as much as 100%, but the outages are limited in time to just 1% of the time. So that's, 2 nines or something like that, reliability, or many hundreds of hours a year of outages. So let's consider these two less stringent reliability guarantees and see how that changes the balance. So if you add these less stringent guarantees to a plot that now includes, again, this is the cloud and AI data center demand and the reliable power for data centers. What you'll see is that 80% reliable allows 13% more capacity for AI and cloud data centers by 2028, but is still insufficient to meet the demand as shown by the red line. If I use the 0% reliable scheme, it allows for 38% more capacity for the AI and cloud data centers. That's sufficient to meet the demand. But how bad is it for the data centers? Well, if they accept that demand, accept that guarantee, it turns out that when you simulate for the year, that they get 99.6% power availability and a 0.4% outage rate. So the answer is it's actually pretty good, and this may actually be a higher availability rate than they've experienced in certain other power grids in recent times. I won't pick on any particular power grids, and probably okay because they have reliability provisioning inside of the data center as well. And what's more important is that this 99.6% power availability is nearly the same as the grid's LOLE goal of 99.9%. So the point is the grid is only trying to achieve 99.9%. So this is really more or less the same as what the grid is trying to achieve. So that's a good story. So if we actually relax the guarantee for the EIR grid, you actually could provide enough power for this data center growth. Let's look at the other hot data center market, the most hot data center power grid market, which is Dominion, which is in Northern Virginia, the United States. This is also sometimes known as Data Center Alley. Here, I'm going to use a similar kind of plot, and here's the projection for cloud and AI data center demand. And in Dominion, it's pretty amazing if you drive through that area. Over 24% of the grid capacity is tied up in data centers. So really almost a quarter, and is growing at this phenomenal rate, as shown by this red line. If you use this projection, using the reliable data center limit, the planned capacity of the Dominion grid will meet only 55% of the AI and cloud data center demand by 2028. So they're in the process of radically revising their plans and their estimates up and up and up to try and catch up to this exponential because they were not planning on it. If you look at the 80% reliable and 0% reliable, they're both, grossly insufficient to meet the demand as well. And what's worse is if you were to accept that data center 0% reliable, 99% available guarantee, in fact, they could not even achieve the 99% power availability, and there would be like an 11.5% outage rate. And this is the daily data center outage rate. It looks pretty bad over the year. So really, you're not able to get very reliable power at all. So the story is that this increased flexibility is not enough to actually allow you to meet the power demand needs inside of Dominion. So we're in a bad situation there, and there's a huge competition going on about who's going to pay and finance for all this growth, and who can do it fast enough actually to meet this data center demand. If you look at several other power grids, we studied 3 other power grids to see if this is a widespread effort, widespread problem. It turns out actually that that there's actually quite a lot of data center capacity available in the CAISO grid, the ERCOT grid, and the SPP grid, based on our projections of cloud and AI growth. And these data centers should be able to support pretty rapid increase in data center growth with 100% reliability with traditional guarantees over the next 5 years. So to summarize, I mean, there's this talk as if there's some kind of a national crisis in power grid capacity. I think it's really not true. Of course, AI is not the only source of demand. Increase in manufacturing is a source of demand, and so on. Lots of grids are a few grids are challenged, particularly the Ireland grid and Dominion are challenged, but there are other grids with sufficient capacity. A lot of cases, the challenges are transmission. This study was done on the basis of generation balance. But there is lots of capacity in a number of these grids and so on. The full paper actually was presented in e-energy in Singapore just earlier this month. So the point is, right, let me just wrap up and say the point of this study is to show actually the engagement between the data centers and the guarantee provided between the grid and the data centers is super important here, right? As you all know, almost all data centers have some kind of reliability of power provisioning inside of the data center, not only UPS, but perhaps also backup generation and other kinds of aggressive kinds of technologies, increasingly energy storage, other kinds of regulation. So in fact, many of the so-called outages may not actually appear as service outages at the compute service layer, though they may appear to be happening at the electric power grid layer. So this idea of reliability layering, which of course is intrinsic to anyone who builds reliable systems, is going to be an important part actually about how we build flexible power grids and how we support the maximum capacity economically in those power grids. And I'll say a few things about that in a few minutes. So that was topic one. Let me switch now and talk about why should we be thinking about these dynamic ways of managing this reliability guarantee with the power grid. I think we should actually go even further. We should actually have a dynamic view of how we acquire power from the power grid for economic reasons as well as sustainability reasons. So we need hundreds of megawatts of power. So how do we acquire it at low cost and green? Well, the power grid, as the joke goes, is not your grandfather's power grid. If you look at what's happening in the power grid all over, there's widespread disruption. It's not at all like it was even 20 years ago, much less, and we're in the steep part of this S-curve. You think the power grid is being a stable thing. No, it's in a violent S-curve transition. And that happened starting in the US at least about 20 years ago when the federal government deregulated power generation and distribution, created these ISOs, these power markets. And that gave rise to these massive decentralized generators. That's what the, renewables are called in this power grid world. And these renewables aren't tiny little things like you have on your rooftop, like an 8 kilowatt kind of thing. You should be thinking of them as gigantic things. So just to set that in your mind, here's a picture of a 1.2 gigawatt solar farm in Spain. And here's a truly astonishing picture from a 8 gigawatt wind generation plant in Gansu, China. One of the overlooked things going on is that China is the world's largest generator of renewable energy by a large margin. So these dynamic generators, right? Renewables are dynamic, are combined together through market and online optimization-based clearing and scheduling. And that produces very volatile, fluctuating kinds of power behavior, both for availability as well as for price. So what goes on is that if you look at how these power markets resolve themselves, and here's a study from some European power grid markets, as you can see, the price fluctuates by as much as 1,000x, right, in variation. And these are some European power grids. These are the Japan spot price power grids. I'll show you in a minute some Texas power grid data. But the idea here is that because these grids are so spiky, if you take and exclude a small few percentage of these high spikes, you can actually reduce the average power cost by as much as 90%. And this is a typical sort of reliability long-tail curve. It's a typical price long-tail curve. It's extremely stable, right? It's not going to go away anytime soon. And this is what you're paying for when you sign a fixed price contract. You're paying for that long tail. And the point is, if you're willing to give up a little bit of availability, right, at the power grid level, you can actually dramatically reduce your power cost. Another example of this is that prices can not only be low and high, they can also even be negative. It turns out zero is just another number, right, in these, economists sort of scale of incentives. So in fact, in many cases, power can have a negative value for extremely long periods of time. And this is a chart from Lancium. It also is available from the RE website that I'll mention later. And it shows, you can find on this RE website a very nice evolution of the increasing frequency of negative pricing sort of all over the US market. This, of course, is concentrated in regions with large renewable supply and with limited ability to export this due to transmission. And this is a secular trend of growth with increased renewables. And despite the fact that there's major initiatives to build more and more transmission, the experience of the CREZ transmission in Texas, I think, suggests that it's not possible to catch up, that this is a fundamental property of volatile generation. So we've done a ton of work in this space. If you're interested in this kind of dynamic of the power markets and so on, here's a whole bunch of citations that I'll leave with you. We're by far not the only ones working in this space, but super interesting, super surprising. Here at the bottom is the ReWeb tool if you want to just pull that up. That's an example of you can see what's going on. So that creates the opportunity actually to acquire lots of power at low cost if you're willing to give up some reliability, or if you're willing to operate dynamically. Let's say unweight the time intervals when power costs $1,000, or even in the case of Texas, $10,000 a megawatt hour. Just don't use as much power then, or don't use power at all then, and use power when it is close to zero price, or even better, negative price, get paid for using power. And one of the, sort of not widely known secrets is that a lot of these Bitcoin companies actually have been making nearly as much money off of their power arbitrage and their power contracts, where they play these kinds of 90-10 games or 97-3 games, as they've been making off of their Bitcoin operations. It's kind of an amazing thing to be a large power consumer these days. So the idea here, the dream here was that if you can reduce your power costs by 90% in the ways that I've just described, you can bring your TCO estimate back into balance. And here, this is assuming you can reduce the OPEX for the power down to 9%. And this brings this picture back into one that looks pretty much like it looked like for the previous, say, 3 or 4 decades, right, of supercomputer operation. Now, there's a much better set of charts than this updated in Tristan Sharma's master's thesis, which is available off of our webpage, which has updated projections for some of this kind of stuff for the Fugaku case study that I'll talk about in just a minute. So the idea here is that you could build a supercomputer, build a cloud data center, actually that exploits these dynamics of the power grid in order to acquire power that's low carbon and low cost. In order to do that, you have to build a different kind of system, or you'd like to build a different kind of system that can be dynamic. So we've been doing research on that. The first time we proposed the idea of zero carbon cloud, the reaction of the cloud data center community was, oh my gosh, that'll never work because financially it doesn't make any sense to build all that excess capacity. So the idea of dynamic data centers is really trying to address that question of, do you need to actually pay for building all that excess capacity, or can you flex, right, and create capacity headroom on the cheap? And this is, I think, idea has taken root and is being explored quite intensively. So what is the idea? The idea is that, the way we think about data centers traditionally is that there's some compute capacity. And as I increase power, as shown on the y-axis here, of course, that capacity increases, right? And then, of course, the compute power doesn't quite increase on the same line as the total data center power. And the gap between these two, or the ratio between these two, is what we commonly call PUE, right? And we traditionally have a pretty simplistic view of this. We assume some kind of linearity across some kind of an operating range. I'm probably being charitable over here by showing this as being somewhat close to zero. It might be much higher, like 30 or 40 or 50%. So the idea of building a dynamic data center is to allow actually the data center to not just be optimized for the optimum PUE location, right, which is perhaps here, not to optimize for energy efficiency, and hence the comment about the goal will actually be to not build the most energy efficient systems. The goal will be to build the most carbon efficient or cost efficient systems. The idea here is to optimize for multiple operating points, right? We have to keep the PUE. The PUE, of course, is critical for high carbon, high cost power, right? So when we're running, when the cost of everything is really high, then we want the PUE to be as good as possible. But it turns out the PUE is not critical when we're dealing with an environment in which there's low carbon, low cost power, like I just showed you. There's excess renewable generation, there's lots of solar generation, or so on, right? So at those times, we're going to operate up in this range where we can have a higher PUE, and that's okay. And of course, the CapEx you have to pay for all the time, right? So the CapEx is critical always. So the idea is you want to keep the CapEx down, but you want to allow for this PUE to flex so that you can have increased compute capacity when you need it. So the idea here is to operate here on this side of the equation when low carbon or low price power is available. And then really what you're going to do is wind up operating over here to the left when the power gets really, really expensive. And there's a nice vision piece written on this, which describes the idea and the conception that I'm going to describe in just a minute, that was in the Hot Carbon Workshop of 2 years ago now. So how is it possible? I mean, you've been told this dogma for years that somehow data centers are optimized for PUE and they're wonderful and energy efficiency is the most important thing. And that is very much the tradition. But what's going on underneath the covers in the industry, of course, and in the cloud is a much more flexible view of the world. So why is this possible? At a fundamental scientific level, you can increase power capacity without increasing CapEx by trading some kind of this energy efficiency. So for example, right, if we have a machine room, it'll have a chilled water loop, it'll have a cooling tower, and so on. What we can do to increase the cooling capacity is we can increase the flow rates, right? At all of these levels, right? In this loop, and in the room, and so on. Now, the normal reason why you wouldn't do this is it decreases energy efficiency. It decreases the efficiency of the pumps. There's resistive losses. They can even grow non-linearly. We've studied all of these things, but it's still possible at some cost in energy efficiency to drive this capacity up. You can do more. You can lower the temperature, right? It's become popular to run data centers with hot water and hot air, and that does increase energy efficiency. But if we increase this gradient, right, that is, we run with cooler water, we run with cooler air, we can actually increase the heat transfer capacity without increasing the CapEx of the system. We just drive these systems at a higher rate. Yes, it decreases the energy efficiency of the compressors and the HVAC, and we can utilize redundant equipment we have for just reliability and so on. We can probably increase the capacity, I would say easily by 20 to 30%, if not more, without much increase in CapEx. Why haven't we done this in the past? Again, we've been worshiping at the altar of energy efficiency, and that turns out to not be the most important thing in this dynamic world. And then finally, one thing that's often ignored but came to the fore when several regions had record heat. It turns out there's seasonal headroom also in almost all locations. And what you can see at the right here is that the temperature in a region varies over time, and the humidity in a region varies over time, right? These are monthly charts, right? Pretty rare you see a monthly variation chart. But what that means is that, in Iowa or in Arizona, you can run at different capacities at different times of the year because intrinsically your cooling problem is different because of the external environments. And then at the compute level, we know how to talk about these things. We have ideas like turbo and sprinting and all of this kind of stuff. So the point is, it is possible to generate, headroom, dynamic range, flexible power capacity without increasing CapEx, just by exploiting operational flexibility. So to explore this, we've been building a detailed cooling model for the Fugaku system, and I won't go through this in any kind of detail, but the idea is that there's multiple loops of chilled water and air and chillers and heat transfer to the external world. This model is is not engineering complete, but it's complete from a modeling of capacity point of view. And this allows us to capture multiple levels of heat transfer capacities, water temperature, efficiency, and so on. So this couples to the external environment. We can set the external temperature and the external humidity, which affects, as shown here, the efficiency of the cooling towers. And it couples to the internal environment in that based on what the requested heat load is, then we generate a optimum configuration, because now you're choosing temperatures and flow rates across all of these different parts of the cooling infrastructure to determine how to best realize the heat transfer that you need to achieve, and therefore the PUE that you're actually achieving when you're running at that particular capacity for that particular external environment. So I don't have time to talk about this in detail, but to give you an example of what's possible, we recently published a paper in the Energy of this year called FlexCool DC that looks at data center cooling flexibility for trading off water use versus energy use. So the idea here is in some locations now, environmental use of water, that is the destruction of potable water, which is what we do when we spray and do evaporative cooling, is a big problem and increasingly a problem with growth. So what you can see is that the model allows you to characterize the water use and then the water savings as a function of location and as a function of, sorry, the chart got lost here at the bottom, but this is the January to December, so it's over the year for different regions. So Germany, Texas, Texas, California, and France. You can also compute the energy overhead, because when you stop using the water, you have to replace it with dry cooling, right? And you have to, you know, run those heat pumps and the air conditioners and so on that much faster. And this is how much energy you're losing. Note that the scale here is about 10% in the middle here versus about 50% for the water. Associated with that energy use, there's a carbon overhead. There's a little bit of background noise. Someone's got some. Okay, great. There's a carbon overhead associated with the consumption of that power. And then when you put it all together, you have to ask, what is the TCO increase that you wind up experiencing, right? And it does turn out, of course, that using the water saved you money. That was the reason why you were doing it. But in fact, the TCO increase is modest for much of the year, like less than 2% for 6 or 8 or 9 months of the year. And it can be a few more percent, right, in the extreme heat of the summer. So this model can be used for a bunch of different experiments, right, to understand the cost of realizing this kind of dynamic flexibility. So that's another piece of the puzzle, the ability to actually build flexible data centers. Of course, you know, when you have these flexible data centers, you're going to need to operate them with flexibility, exploiting our HPC kinds of workloads. Fortunately, we have extremely flexible workloads. And you might also care about what time of day you run these workloads. You might also care about the location you run them in. There have been some exciting experiments to actually do capacity sharing across sites to improve sustainability. That's a really exciting direction. But what is the idea here? The idea is basically to align consumption with low price power or low carbon power. Simple idea is that this is data from the German power grid, where, you know, you might decrease your power use during the day when historically there was competition for load. I think this data is a little bit outdated. In fact, you probably would be increasing your consumption during the day now with all the solar energy available in Germany. But the idea is to use when the power cost is low or the carbon is low and conserve when it's high. And then these plots show the effect of constant power budget and the result on resource capacity or average resource capacity over different months of the year. And the challenges, of course, here are you can't flex infinitely, right? You can't flex up to 500%. You can't flex down to 0. And the economic limits around TCO that I just described before. But there's a huge, huge resistance to this in the community, which is the tradition of trying to run our data centers as full as possible all the time, which I think has to change if we're going to reap these kinds of benefits. There's a bunch of studies that were in Sam Zong's paper in JSSP B21, also many more that were in her PhD dissertation that was completed in January of 23 and is available if you're interested. So let me try to, so those are, touching on all of these different ideas. The idea is that there's enough capacity in the grid, if you can be flexible, that we can build data centers that have dynamic flexibility, and that we can do resource scheduling. So we've been trying to put this together for about the last 2 years. In the last year, working intensively with the Fugaku Riken team to try and make sure our studies are actually well calibrated. And much of this pulled together was actually covered in Tristan Sharma's master's thesis that was just completed this month. So what are we trying to do in the context of Fugaku? Well, the idea is we're trying to figure out how to build this next generation of leadership supercomputing systems. And, we'd like to use Fugaku as a success model for that. Very successful system, lots of pioneering ideas in it. When it came online, it was something in the low 20s of megawatts, and was the world's fastest supercomputer for several years. So if we target a successor system in a 2030 kind of time frame, 10 years out, the projected power, according to our projection model, is something around 120 megawatts. Of course, part of the challenge is to build an innovative computer design. I don't want to minimize that. But another part of the challenge is power availability and cost. When we did the projection for that, it looked like running this system for 8 years would be something like $1.8 billion of power. So that would probably dwarf the cost of the system. So that alone is a non-starter unless you can do something creative like what we're talking about. So the approach for our study is that we built a detailed model of Japan's future energy landscape. Then we modeled the dynamic supercomputer, and we modeled energy storage, and then we characterized the opportunities for reductions in carbon and cost. So what does it mean to model a power grid? Well, let's tell you a little bit about the Japan power grid. I know there are a few experts from Japan, so they probably know more about the power grid there than I do. But for the rest of us, let's do a little calibration. So Japan has a really interesting power grid. It's about 1,000 terawatt hours per year. So when you see numbers like, the cloud companies are reaching into the tens of terawatt hours per year, maybe approaching 100 within the decade, it's a substantial fraction of the total power, say, in a country like Japan, you could imagine. It's 10 regional power companies, rich transmission infrastructure. Most interesting, Japan has embarked on a really rapid, accelerated growth of renewables, where in 2023, renewables provided 16% of the power grid's energy. It's expected to grow to 37% by 2030. So that's 2.5 times increase. And by 2040, it's expected to grow to 55%. So almost 4 times increase. They have a fully liberalized power market. And of course, Riken is in the Kansai region. It's the Kansai Electric Power Division. And in 2023, the fuel mix for Kansai was 50% thermal. That means fossil fuel, 9% hydro, and about 31% nuclear. And the solar and wind were a tiny fraction. So radical change going on. They've instituted some aggressive renewable energy incentives, and that affects sort of the cost and economics of power pricing. One really interesting thing is going on is they have something called a feed-in premium, and that's based on a release price, which is set on a temporal monthly kind of basis, and the subsidy is being paid as the fraction between these things. Their prices are required to be positive. They don't allow their prices to go negative in their current market structure. I think the price is set to be some fraction of a yen, sort of greater than 0 per kilowatt hour. But there's active debate about whether they should go to what you might call an American-style power market or European-style power market, where you would allow negative pricing. And there's some folks advocating for it, but it's not decided actually what the public policy will be 3 and 5 and even 10 years out. So we analyzed both of these scenarios. Just a little bit more contextual. How am I doing on time here, Michael? What should I shoot for finishing here?
5 minutes left.
Okay, I'll try and finish in 5 minutes. So power cost and load. So, this is just a typical power pricing curve for a grid with renewable energy. It drops down in the day and goes back up. Here's what the demand looks like over the day typically. There's seasonal variation, right? Here's the seasonal variation: winter, summer, winter and summer peaks, heating and air conditioning. And here's the very rapid increase in renewable fraction that's expected over the next, say, 15 years, right? And you can see this curve is very, very steep. Right? So what happens when you apply that? If you apply that power cost model to future computer systems with traditional supercomputer operation, you can see on the left here with the current market pricing scenario, you get just what you'd expect. The dotted line blue is the today's scenario, and as we go forward in time, the price of power is going to decrease in a secular fashion, 24% from 23 to 27, and it'll be 59% lower by 2040. If you assume a Western-style negative pricing scenario market, the average power cost can actually be negative during the day, and you'll see an even larger decrease, 28% between now and 2027, as the over-generation of solar really kicks in, as much as 78% lower by 2040. So the idea here is that change in power grid mix alone is going to create this temporal shifting and this huge incentive, right, to align with renewable generation. It's going to grow rapidly. If you add intelligent dynamic management of this, you can see that you're getting even larger improvements. So the average power cost, daily power cost in that power grid, as you go from from a fixed data center capacity, the blue line, to a dynamic one with increasing levels of regression, plus and minus 20, plus and minus 30, plus and minus 40, plus and minus 60, sorry, plus and minus 20, plus and minus 40, plus and minus 60. You can see you can drive down dramatically the cost of power in these expensive times because you're using less at that time, and you get little benefit during the day, but that's not a bad thing because you're actually increasing the available capacity by quite a lot. Same is true for the negative pricing scenario, a little bit more extreme benefits. If you add energy storage, you can see, consider traditional supercomputer operation with battery storage of 20, 40, 80, 60, 20, 40, 60, 80 megawatts. This is not a lot of energy storage. I know it may sound like kind of a lot, but in fact, compared to a 100 megawatt data center, this is less than 1 hour of storage. So it's much less than what they're putting onto the power grid in large scale fashion in lots of places where they're adding 2 and 4 hours of storage. And you can see that what happens is that the power cost falls in the expensive times as before. And projected carbon emissions also falls during these times when you would be triggering lots of fossil fuel generation. This is the TCO benefits. Again, you can see with the large-scale dynamic data centers, reductions in the power cost at various points in time of the day of nearly 3x. Sorry, my mouse is disappearing. Nearly 3x in the expensive times as you go to the extreme dynamic data center scenarios. Carbon benefits, just what you'd expect. Carbon goes down dramatically. This is for the whole grid over time, right, as the grid decarbonizes. And when you apply that to these various dynamic data center scenarios, what you can see is the funny kind of phenomena, which is here's the flat data center operation. What you can do is dramatically reduce the carbon emissions, right, in the fossil fuel intensive times. And then you're actually going to slightly increase your carbon emissions during the highly available solar period of the day. Why is that? Because you're actually going to run a dramatically higher output, dramatically higher capacity during the day, because you're flexing to this very, very high dynamic range of as much as 130%. And that's up from 70, so it's nearly double. And that doubling is going to allow you to increase your compute capacity by a dramatic amount, but in fact, only increase your emissions by a small amount during the day. Okay, I'm going to have to finish through this because I'm running out of time here. So the point here is that the power costs are going to see a dramatic increase in volatility, but a secular decline. Dynamic management gives you a large benefit between as much as 1.5x to almost 100% cost elimination during certain periods of time, with corollary benefits of carbon emissions. Addition of modest energy storage multiplies these benefits, doubling them to as much as increasing them by a factor of 10, where the cost is really nearly eliminated. So the approaches we consider to be promising, and we're continuing to have discussions with the Fugaku Riken team. And it's interesting actually to look, Fugaku actually plots a bunch of really interesting dashboards, right, that show pending jobs and show different use by different jobs in different power modes and so on. And one of the interesting questions on the scheduling side is, can you actually just use scheduling to generate most of this dynamic variation that I was talking about, and thereby match the workload to the dynamics needed to work well with the power grid? Okay, so we've completed all of this stuff. We've characterized the power cost and carbon reduction. We have a proposed set of management approaches, though there's much refinement needed. We're starting to explore potential power infrastructure augmentation, storage and maybe on-site generation. And we're also beginning to study some other locations, because now we have a template to do this. So if folks are interested in generating some kind of a research partnership, we're interested in talking to parties about this. So the dream, of course, right, is to achieve leadership HPC by shifting, right, this kind of TCO balance that we're facing, that we're projecting, right, where the green, which is the OpEx power, dominates, to the traditional model of TCO that we know how to live with, where the dynamic reduction and management of these data centers and supercomputers, right, to match the power grid's dynamics, allows us to reduce a 51% power OpEx to only 9% contribution to TCO. So this is, I think, a potential opportunity for how we can get forward and continue to build large-scale computing systems. Oh, I don't have time to talk about this. So this is what I normally talk about. I'm just going to jump through this. This is working with the grid is hard. If you're going to be swinging 60 megawatts, you guys know you can't just do that. Okay, let me just go to my summary slide, Michael, because I'm way over. And I don't know if we maybe have time for a question or two. So I'll post these slides afterward. I apologize for running over. But to summarize, if we're going to build multi-100 megawatt supercomputer facilities, we need large quantities of low price, low carbon power. And there's a way to do this. The idea is to adapt and exploit the statistical nature of these power grids, cost and low carbon. And the good news is they actually need us to do this. So this is going to be viewed as a positive thing for society and a positive thing for these power grids. But to make this cost effective, we need dynamic data centers to exploit this. And that requires reopening, right, this box of PUE and reopening the cooling system and the power distribution system and managing it in a much more flexible fashion. Of course, we have to make it work with SLAs and SLOs for our workloads. We're fortunate in the HPC and batch and AI world because for lots of our workload, not all of it, but lots of our workload, it's possible to operate in this asynchronous fashion. So we have a lot of flexibility in our workloads, and therefore we have the potential to actually meet these kinds of needs. The integrative study we've done with Fugaku Next actually shows the promise of what's possible. Of course, coordinating these large adaptive loads with the power grid is continuing to be a challenge. So future sustainable HPC leadership requires this ambitious dynamic approach. Again, I apologize for running over. I'd be happy to take any questions if there's time.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for this fantastic presentation. We're actually out of time, but we only have 2 questions from Bill Brantley in the chat, so maybe you can answer quickly those 2 questions. So the first one is, are increased power transmission capacity assumed in the studies you showed today?
Let's see. So I'm not sure which part of the talk Bill was referring to, but the assumption is that there's enough power transmission capacity to the data center, of course, right? So if you had a nominal 120 megawatt data center and you're flexing up and down, you have to, of course, be able to achieve the maximum of that. That's typically a modest increase of 20 or 30 or 40%. That's not the most expensive thing. The dynamics, if the question was about the dynamics of the power grid, I think the projections, right, are based on market models that don't actually model the transmission capacity in detail. So they wouldn't be assumed in or assumed not. They assume to be sort of a neutral, persistent effect at the same scale they are today. What are economic incentives to improve the grid? That's an active topic of political debate in Texas. Yeah, I have another fun slide that I like to show, which is about zero carbon cloud. And we proposed and published this idea of zero carbon cloud, which is this idea of a data center that only runs when there's curtailed renewable energy available or stranded power available. And we proposed this, and it turned out that the first adopters for this was a company called Lancium, which I think many of you know. Michael McNamara showed up on my doorstep in 2018 and said, hey, we saw you wrote these papers about the zero carbon cloud thing. We want to do this at scale. So they went off and did this at scale in Texas. And then so did Riot Blockchain and several other companies. Turns out the biggest, most agile, fast mover for this is Bitcoin mining, right? Because that's a load you can turn on and turn off and so on. So that, you know, whatever you think about Bitcoin, turned out to be the biggest use of this idea. And then, of course, you know, Ted Cruz was seen on the floor of the U.S. Senate saying the Bitcoin miners were going to save the Texas power grid, right? So the idea here is that they've built a market product called LFLT, right? Let's see, LFLTF is the name of the task force. Large flexible load is the name of the product. And the idea is you can sign up for power that they turn off whenever the grid, you know, doesn't have enough. And it's much more than demand response because it's more like a 1 or 2 or 3% outage. And you can do this based on price, or you can do it based on all kinds of things. So it's exactly the idea we talked about for harvesting low cost power. So that is an incentive, right, for trying to solve these problems in the power grid. Now, Ted Cruz's idea, or really what the blockchain people's idea or the Bitcoin people's idea is, look, you know, there's all this excess unreliable capacity in the grid, and we're going to provide economic support for the whole grid, right, by buying power during those times, right, by soaking up all of this renewable energy when other people aren't around to consume it. So that's the idea, I think, that the Bitcoin people are pushing. They're providing a community service because they're supporting these renewable generation projects and so on. It's the same kind of argument the cloud people were giving you many years ago. So I think I don't have, you know, sort of a simple yes or no answer to your question, Bill, but I think there's a lot of debate and trying to understand, you know, can we fix the power grid with economic incentives in the power grid lens alone? Right? Can you provide a large enough pricing incentive to actually shift load from different times of day? Can you provide a large enough incentive that people will accept unreliable electricity generation? That's what we're actually the experimentation we're doing. Texas is an extreme form of this. Texas has, as far as I know, the highest positive and negative price swings, right, allowed in their power market. So I think it's plus 10,000, minus 10,000 now. In other places, it's plus or minus 1,000. In other places, it's as little as plus or minus 100. So if you believe in the theory that we're going to use economic incentives to solve these problems, then one example of that is by increasing this dynamic range, because eventually it'll become big enough to incentivize people to do the right thing. I think if you look carefully at the power grid outages in Texas, it doesn't turn out to be quite true for the big rewards that were reaped by the people who maintained service during the ERCOT outages in the winter and so on. You know, a lot of those damages or costs were actually clawed back in the aftermath of the government and the regulatory environment saying, no, we have to make the people who are damaged by these prices whole. So I don't know, you know, the public policy dynamics of how that could possibly work out. But there's no question that economic incentives are a huge part of this problem and how to solve it. My personal belief is you can't solve this within just the confines of the power grid. You can't set the power prices high enough in a fair enough way to actually solve these problems. You guys know, because you guys operate large-scale supercomputers, every hour that the power is out, you're losing a very, very valuable resource, right? That might be worth 100 times or 1,000 times per hour to deliver that supercomputer or deliver that cloud services and so on. So there's this extreme economic differential between different value layers that make it really, really hard to solve the problem purely at the grid level. I think you're going to see some constructive engagement, I hope, between higher value layers and economic incentives across those layers and the power grid to solve this problem. You can read that as some of the large loads will be told you have to behave in different ways, you have to accept different guarantees if you want such large quantities of power.
Okay, Andrew, I think we need to stop here. We already sacrificed our break.
I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
No, all good. That was very interesting and very insightful. Thank you very much for this great presentation.
You're welcome. Thank you all. And I would be happy to follow up with anyone afterwards. Feel free to reach out.
Okay, thank you. So, Sid, I guess back to you.
Yep. Thank you so much, Andrew and Michael. Taking over the screen share. Okay, next up is a very interactive session, what I hope to be interactive. I'd like to welcome Vali Sorell. Vali is a senior data center design engineer for Oracle. Before joining Oracle, Vali worked for Microsoft as a principal hardware engineer for data center integration services. They have years of design experience dedicated to mission-critical projects. At Glumac, they were responsible for leading the mechanical design team in developing innovative, energy-efficient, reliable, next-generation data center concepts through industry groups such as ASHRAE TC 9.9, ASHRAE SSPC 90.4, and 7x24 Exchange, and through various other industry publications. They continue to push for the continuous development of industry best practices. They have a BS in mechanical engineering from Columbia University and another BS in genetics from McGill University. Thanks again, Vali, for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you. Can I share my desktop?
Yes, you may.
Okay, let me, okay. I will share this. Let me know when you can see this. And I will try to go into.
We can see it.
Can't see my controls there. You can see this now, right?
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you for the introduction. I've been doing data center design for like 25 years at this point. And every year I say, what an exciting time to be here. May I live in interesting times. And every year I find that it gets more and more interesting. It's like right out of Alice in Wonderland. Things are getting curiouser and curiouser. So here I am 25 years later, still amazed by the amount of growth that has been going on in the industry. The one thing that I have been dying to see over the years, but every time the issue comes up, seems to get delayed more and more. And that's the issue of liquid cooling in one form or another. I think the industry has been wanting to go there because it has obvious benefits in the sense that it can increase the load density, it can increase the compute power. Just CPUs used to consume 100, maybe less watts, actually less watts than that. And all of a sudden, GPUs have increased the ability to compute up to what's actually reaching about 1,000 watts per device. So the power that's inherent in our compute abilities at this point has just grown exponentially. And the only way to actually cool it is to do liquid cooling. So after 20 years or so of waiting for the liquid cooling revolution, we're there. I'm like, all of a sudden we hit a wall, and I've been asking, to borrow probably an overused metaphor, I've been asking for water. I'm parched. I need water. I need water. And all of a sudden somebody offers me a fire hose. And that's exactly where I find myself. So all of a sudden, in waiting all of this time, unfortunately, we haven't really made a heck of a lot of progress in developing some of the details that are needed to actually implement liquid cooling. And the questions that I've been confronted with now, trying to make it a reality, are things that I guess surprise me, but all things that I think we just need to get some industry consensus. And everything that I'm talking about right now relates to strictly liquid cooling and liquid for direct-to-chip. So that's a cold plate on a processor with a special loop that we call the technology cooling loop, or technology cooling system, which is kept separate from the cooling plant. As these loads have increased, the temperatures of that cooling liquid has also dropped so that the processors can operate harder, faster. They reject so much heat that you actually need colder water. So as we were thinking at some point, maybe 10 or so years ago, that going to liquid cooling, we would need to, or we would be able to eliminate the chiller plant, which from my standpoint is the most expensive and flakiest part of any mechanical infrastructure system. I thought, yay, we can get rid of the chillers. Well, now the temperatures are dropping again. For those who are following ASHRAE, the classifications for water to the chip is called the S class. So S40 means that no higher than 40 C to the chip. 35, no higher than 35 C to the chip. S30 just left ASHRAE 2 days ago. And at ASHRAE, the IT subcommittee discussed going to S20, S15, S10, only because the demand has increased so quickly that we need to get colder and colder water from a cooling plant, chiller plant, basically. And maybe if we get to S15 and S10, we'll have to start thinking about other means, because even a chiller plant doesn't normally operate at such lower temperatures. So we have to rethink how we do our refrigeration cycle. So we need to pick different refrigerants, different temperatures. All of these design issues are coming to the forefront at this point. And so the three issues that I see and have had to deal with as we're going into multiple data centers are what to do about very quickly or rapidly changing loads. If a cluster of servers increases their capacity from literally idle condition to 100 in a few milliseconds, how does the mechanical system respond to that? So in my way of viewing it, probably putting buffer tanks in the system is the best approach. Also, how do you control the flow into the racks, the IT racks that are liquid cooled? I thought it should be trivial. It's actually not that trivial, but it's actually a very interesting thing. And finally, if I have time, I want to talk about the sizing of the loop. So this is kind of a very broad category, and there's probably no right answer. So all of these three issues that I want to cover are very high level. I'm not getting any specifics about it. There are probably some non-disclosure issues that I probably wouldn't want to discuss, but this is the kind of thing that we are all, as an industry, coming to terms with. So what I'm actually doing is I'm presenting the questions, but I'm hoping that if I don't get answers from the audience, we can at least get some reasonable discussion and start discussing how to approach these things, which are very real to me. So let me just point out at a very simple level what the technology cooling system really looks like. Let's see, can you see my mouse? Anybody?
Yes.
You can see the mouse, right? Yeah, okay. So we've got the liquid cooled IT racks in a loop that's fed from a cooling distribution unit. So basically, the cooling distribution unit has onboard pumps that pump the technology cooling system water into the racks, and I'm calling this TCS supply, technology cooling system. It goes into the racks, goes right down to the chip level. The TCS water picks up the heat, gets returned back, comes back hot, and on the other side of this heat exchanger, I have the chiller plant, which is putting out chilled water, and we're calling it facility cooling water, and I'm designating facility cooling water supply. So this is the cold water, and it picks up the heat from this heat exchanger and returns it back to the chiller plant, cooling plant, whatever the system is at back of house to be able to reject the heat to the outside. So this is just a very basic view of that configuration. So let's see, whoops, there. So I alluded to what the basic problem is as far as what we're confronting at this point. So these IT clusters that are now used for high performance computing, AI, machine learning, they, at first it was reported that they can go from 0 to 100 in milliseconds. And it's actually not true. It's not 0. It's actually an idle state, which can be 20, 30, 40% of the maximum condition. But when a workload is sent to a processor, it theoretically just goes all out, goes to 100%, and it does do that in milliseconds. There has been discussion about, and actually every design team that I confront with me representing the owner, they say, oh, this isn't like a real, individual servers may do that, right? But across the entire data center, that's all washed out, isn't it? And the answer actually wasn't that direct to me. I went to our own IT hardware networking people, and I said, what's the reality of this issue? And the unanimous response that I'm getting back is, oh yeah, absolutely. We pulled together 50,000 GPUs in a cluster, or 100,000. The bigger we can make it, the better. And the question is, so do all 50,000, 100,000, whatever that number of GPUs in that cluster, do they all get the same signal to ramp up? Yes, absolutely. It does happen, and it does increase the load in milliseconds, literally milliseconds. The next question after that is, do we actually observe it? I was actually speaking to one of our electrical engineers who has since observed through monitoring of the UPS systems in the data centers. Yes, we can see when it actually happens. So the following question is, how often does it happen? Does it go up to 100% and stay there for an hour? Or does it go up to 100% and stay up there for 10 seconds, which from the mechanical or infrastructure point of view, it does make a huge difference, because if it stays up at 100% for 10 seconds, the impact to the plant is actually somewhat dampened quite a bit. But if it stays up there for an hour or longer, or however the resident time of the water in the system, it has an absolute impact on the chiller plant. So the fear that I have is not that we're doing damage to the GPUs, to the racks, because of the steep incline. They can do whatever they want for as long and as many times as they want with a completely unpredictable schedule. There's no way to actually know what the workload's going to be at any one moment. So my concern is not so much that we're doing the harm to the IT equipment, but we're doing not necessarily harm to the chiller plant, but we're doing harm to the entire infrastructure, because we're not able to have chillers respond quickly enough. So if you go from that hypothetical idle condition to 100% in a millisecond, or 3 milliseconds, whatever that value happens to be, you have a slug of hot water that goes out to the CDU. It gets transferred to the chilled water, and it hits the chiller plant, which for most of the time has been operating very pleasantly at maybe a 30 C return temperature, and all of a sudden it gets hit with 40, 45, or 50 C water, and no chiller is going to operate through that. The moment it sees that, it'll shut itself down, and all of a sudden the whole system comes down, and there's not anything you can do about it. So the proposed solution is to put a buffer tank in the return of the TCS, so before it goes into the CDU. So the reason I'm even approaching this I was triggered by a paper or a proposed paper that was submitted to Natalie Bates. Natalie sent it to me. I read it, and it's like an aha moment. So I thank the person who actually put that out there, because after having read it, I have verified it's a real issue. It's a real issue of concern. It needs to be addressed. If we don't address it, we will inadvertently be creating a very unstable performance for the infrastructure, and potentially, depending on how the workload goes through the IT racks, we could be setting us up to actually lose our chiller plant and then have to do a restart. And then all of the servers, of course, need to shut down and wait for things to return to normal again. So it's a reality. We do need to do it. So the idea is to put a buffer tank here. It doesn't have to be a stratified tank. It's a mixing tank. For those who really deal with mechanical systems, you often hear of thermal storage tanks. Thermal storage tanks are also, some people call them buffer tanks, but the difference is a thermal storage tank is put right here in the facility cooling water supply side, because if you lose power and the chillers drop out for 2 or 3 minutes or 5 minutes, you still have a reservoir of cold water, so you can keep the IT racks happily cooled for the duration of that outage. The chillers eventually come back up, they restart on generator power, they restore production of cool water, and that when that condition happens, you bypass the thermal storage, and as a side stream, you recharge slowly. You don't have to put a lot of flow through that thermal storage tank. So the use of thermal storage and buffer tanks is kind of really muddled, but in my context, when I say a buffer tank, I mean that it's a mixing tank in the return side of these loops, whereas the thermal storage tank is a stratified tank on the supply side of the loop. That thermal storage, it can be here in the facility cooling water. If the chiller plant serves many other customers in the colo facility or any other data center, it's possible to actually put it downstream of the CDU also. It will be a smaller one because then it's sized just for the CDU loop. But you can put it here or here, it doesn't matter as long as it's in the supply side. I'm not going to talk about thermal storage anymore. I'm going to talk about buffer tanks. So let's go back to that hypothetical, not so hypothetical, actually a real situation that we have seen actually does occur. The racks or the GPUs do ramp up. They put a slug of hot water, the buffer tank being a mixing tank, instead of immediately going up to the return temperature that would hit the CDU, which then gets transferred to the chiller plant, it mixes it. So all it does is just dampens it. So this buffer tank, all it needs to do is hold the water, mix it. So instead of having a sharp spike in the temperature of the return water, it mixes, blends. There is a spike, it does increase, but the important thing is not to eliminate that rise in temperature. The biggest issue, the biggest reason for doing that is to slow the response so the chiller can keep up with it. The chiller will typically, if it's operating, can respond to a load in maybe a minute. If the chiller is not on, you have to start it up. It may take it 2 minutes to start up, maybe a couple more minutes to come to full production. So if I can hold off the load as it hits the chiller plant, I have in essence been able to now eliminate that possibility. So the obvious pros about it, like I said, it dampens the response or the spike in the temperature that goes out to the technology cooling loop. It's completely passive. It just sits there. When normal conditions or low demand conditions return, it doesn't matter. It's just it's like having a spring in the system. It absorbs energy, gives it back out. It just sits there, does it consistently, and no control is required. No bypass is really required. You may put a bypass just to clean it out occasionally if that's required, but usually the TCS loop water is very clean, so you could probably operate many years with it and not have any kind of concerns. but in essence, it just sits there passively doing its thing. You can still monitor temperatures, and that actually introduces a really interesting point of view. If you do monitor the temperatures into the tank, out of the tank, under normal situations, the temperature would be the same. When you have a sharp spike, the inlet temperature will be very much higher than the outlet temperature. And so that can become an alarm that sends a signal to the chiller plant saying, it's coming, be aware. It's like a fast forward feed loop to say, you have a minute to start, because we don't know what the resident time of the facility water, hot water, is before it hits the chiller. But if we have that 1 minute or so, or maybe even a 2-minute advance notice, may actually enable to reduce the size of the buffer tank. That is all something that needs to be included in the sizing of the tank. So there are obviously drawbacks to putting it. For one thing, we've actually started with this, and the initial guesstimates about the size of the tanks is they're huge. They have to sit right next to the CDUs, and in some cases, the CDU is in the data hall. So now you have liquid in the data hall. The industry's been really uncomfortable having any kind of liquid in the data hall, but that mainframes were liquid cooled. So it's like we're rediscovering the benefits of having liquid, but there are risks. And now we've got space that we need to add for the buffer tank. Also, this liquid is actually expensive. Usually it's propylene glycol, 25% propylene glycol with inhibitors and biocides thrown in, no question about it. And believe it or not, it's really important that the level of contaminants be really, really low. There is actually a spec for it that ASHRAE has published. It's all recommended. There's not yet a complete science to it. But the idea is, if you buy this liquid, and once you put it—
Just going to do a large side cup, and I have my own top.
Sorry, say that again. Okay, sorry, I didn't hear that, if that was a question. Okay, so anyway, the cost does add up. The liquid is pretty expensive, and you may need to store quite a bit. And now you have to apportion some space for the tank, for the liquid, and you've taken on extra cost. They're large, they're heavy, and because the TCS loop has such strict requirements, because the liquid actually doesn't just go through the pipe, it goes through very narrow, almost millimeter type, micron dimension passages as it goes through the cold plate at the GPU level. Anything that the liquid touches should be stainless steel, so that there's no residual compounds that come off the metal. So to make a buffer tank out of stainless steel gets to be really expensive. And actually, theoretically, it should be it should be stainless steel. 316, 304 is probably not that much of an issue, but they're already significantly more expensive than would be an equivalent tank just made of regular black steel. So here's the interesting aspect, and this is why I'm putting it out there. How do we size it? If you oversize it, you've wasted space, time, effort, and probably a lot of money. But there is probably not a right way to do it. And when I've asked our designers to do this, they take the approach of, well, let's see, if I want 2-minute resident time, that's easy. That completely misses the point, because it's much more of a complicated issue, because the factors that go into the sizing of a buffer tank has to look at how much of the load in the entire plant that the plant serves is actually a liquid cooled load. If it's 20%, it probably doesn't matter all that much, because if you have that spike in that 20% load, by the time it mixes with the 80%, it's not going to amount to that much. And you probably don't need a buffer tank under those circumstances. If you have an entire plant that serves a liquid cooled data center, that, let's say, 80% of the load goes to liquid, in that particular case, the load that hits the chiller plant is really substantial, and then you do need to do it. So you need to look at the relative size. You need to look at the total volume of the return pathway in the technology cooling loop. The bigger the volume of liquid, the more natural buffering you already have. Likewise, for the facility cooling water, you can also have a massive return pathway because the pipes get bigger and bigger as you get closer to the plant. And if you have a long distance to travel, that's your natural buffer already. So that plays into the calculation. If I need additional buffering, what size tank do I put in my system? So the sizing and the volume is an issue, but you also have at the CDU level, you're mixing facility cooling water to get the temperature of the technology cooling loop at the right value. That valve can go from mostly closed to complete open. It might take 30 to 60 seconds to do that. The speed of that response is really important also. And you have to look at the speed of response for that valve. And if you try to speed it up, it actually may hurt you because then you get more instability. The slower the response, the more stable the response. The faster the response, then you'll have up and down, and then you can actually miss the load completely. So that becomes a factor. And of course, the duration of the spike. I mentioned right at the beginning, you can have a spike that lasts 10 seconds, or you can have a spike that lasts an hour. And the reason that that makes a big difference is if it lasts 10 seconds, there's already natural buffering in the return pathway to the plant, and you probably don't need a buffer tank, or you may have enough already. So that 10 seconds starts rising the temperature, that slug gets diluted as it gets further downstream to the cooling plant. If it lasts an hour, that spike will hit, it'll be a full spike, and the plant needs to, actually, it's not even an hour. It's basically the resident time of the water from its, in its path from the IT equipment to the plant. That is the duration of the spike. If that corresponds to greater than the duration of the spike, then it's probably not that big a deal. If the spike goes beyond it, it will hit the plant, and you need to consider that. And also, finally, an important aspect, you may have 20 chillers to take on the load. Right now, you have 8 chillers running, 12 idle, and the load hits. To start those chillers may take a few minutes. If you have 18 chillers or 19 or 20 chillers, even at low load, they'll ramp up much faster and be able to respond more quickly. So are they all on and available? Are they ready to, like, at idle? Can you keep them all at idle, or do they drop below a certain load? You do have to turn off chillers if there's no load to them. So you have to balance the energy efficiency at idle or at very low load for that chiller. Is it worth it for me to address that risk by having or as many chillers as I can keep on at that time? Do I want to keep them on and at idle so that they are ready for this kind of spike? And again, the type of spikes, the number of spikes really plays into that. So I'm going to stop and hold here for a second because I see there have been a couple of questions. So luckily, I don't know how I'm doing on time. I've used up about half, but I think the next 2 subjects, I may actually skip my 3rd agenda item because it's kind of really like just a freebie that I threw in just for open discussion. So before I go to the next topic, let me just see if there's any questions right now. So I see that Shlomo, hey Shlomo, look at 2-phase. Good. So 2-phase, like if you're talking closed loop 2-phase, no, we haven't looked at it. I know there are opportunities out there, but right now we are not really dealing with that. At some point in the future, we may, and we'll have to revisit these buffering conditions and load issues carefully at that point. It does change the infrastructure tremendously, because if you have 2-phase, you're no longer talking about propylene glycol. You're talking about a refrigerant of some type. Obviously, it's a closed loop, so you're not going to lose the refrigerant, but you have to deal with the evaporation of the liquid, refrigerant and the condensation. It gives
Now,
very
we can
efficient
talk about it,
performance.
but it solved all the problems that you're solving, which is an excellent solution that you have.
Yeah,
Two
yeah, no
phase
question
basically
about it. Yeah.
works around it.
So yeah, I agree with you completely, Shlomo. And I know that it would solve a lot of problems, but the bulk of the industry right now is dealing mostly with single phase EG25 or that type of liquid cooled system. So right now, that is the majority of applications, and I'm not really delving into two-phase closed loop or two-phase open tank, that type of stuff. Those all have promise in different ways. So I'm excited to see that happen also. But right now, I don't really have opportunity to deal with that.
Vali, you have two people with their hands up as well.
Okay. I can't, I see
So,
Aaron has.
Aaron, please feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead.
this is Aaron Anderson, National Renewable Energy Lab. Just a commentary. Huge fan of buffer tanks, or at least thermal storage, for a number of reasons. I've led two major data center efforts where we were heavily liquid cooled. We built thermal capacity in intentionally for slightly different reasons. Both facilities don't have chiller plants.
Right.
And size things based on kind of ride through of bad wet bulb days. And so that got us to like numbers of 45 minutes of thermal storage. Not a fan of buffer tanks as you're proposing, because in both facilities that I'm aware of, we have 30 to 40 CDUs on the floor already.
That's obviously that's the con of it.
It starts
Absolutely.
to become just another component with another, space capacity.
Right.
And so I guess I'm more of a fan of putting it into your plant
Mm-hmm.
and causing roughly the same result.
Right. No, I agree. Actually, I did. Sorry, go on.
I was going to say hugely helpful. We had an earlier system that was an IBM early liquid cooled system in the early 2000s. And the control sequence was such that it caused absolute fits with the chillers, to the point that we, send slugs of water to the chillers that they just were insanely unhappy with. And the solution was a buffer tank. So we were doing that 20 years ago.
Yeah. So you brought up an interesting issue, and had we gone with liquid cooling the way I thought 10 years ago we would, in which we continuously raised the temperature of the media, we could eliminate the chillers. The chillers are the problem. The whole purpose of the buffer tank, as I'm talking about at this point, is to service the plant, not the other way, not to service the thermal storage services the IT load to make sure it stays up. The buffer tanks is in service of the cooling plant. As the temperatures of the TCS loop keep dropping, I had mentioned S40, S35 is like a current target for the major GPU manufacturer. In the IT subcommittee committee at ASHRAE that I referenced earlier, those same people are saying, we're really pressed. We're trying to get more capacity out of the GPUs. We can do it, but we need S30, S25, S20, which takes us back to chillers. So if we didn't have chillers, if we just had cooling towers, closed circuit fluid, evaporative coolers, dry coolers, that situation is a non-issue, because those can start up as quickly as you can start a pump in the fan. You've got it. You've got the capacity. So there's no issue there. It's all about the chillers. And because the temperatures are dropping precipitously, actually, with continued talk about even colder and colder temperatures, I think the buffer issue, or a way to buffer, is going to become more of a necessity. So as the temperatures drop, and as the loads increase, it may actually make sense to take that buffer tank out of the TCS, put it in the facility return flow, and then it can be just regular black steel or any kind of steel. It's a bigger tank because now it absorbs the buffering of the entire all of the TCS loops. So that's an important consideration. As we go to that, my recommendation would probably be move that buffer tank out of the TCS, put it in the facility water loop.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, our
Yeah.
approach, and obviously, we're 90% liquid cooled. It
Yeah.
stops to make sense. If you've got one or two CDUs, maybe, but
Right. Exactly.
put
Right.
excess thermal capacity in for a lot of reasons. Even chillerless plants, I would argue that you can create ride through of, the thunderstorm that passes through and your evaporative cooling goes to
Right.
crap for 45 minutes.
Hey,
Yep.
let's see. Let's Axel, let's see what you have to say. And then we have some people in the chat too.
Yeah, essentially, you just took my point. I wanted to turn this into a pitch for chiller-free primary side loops, because as you mentioned, then you don't have this issue. And I think we should not give up in convincing all the vendors in keeping this in mind when they design their upcoming processors, GPUs, etc. On the other hand, also if you're going towards chiller free, or at least you typically tend to work with lower delta T's, because you want to have a lower gap between outside temperature and your facility inlet. That means you typically have higher volume flow rates so the flow rate on the primary side will be higher. The total volume of water on the primary side, if you design it, will actually be higher. So you get additional, let's say, intrinsic capacity because you have more water in your primary side anyway, which helps you. But as you said, like, it doesn't eliminate the problem entirely. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Great.
We also have Pascal.
Yes.
Hi. My question was, why don't you place the buffer and the return side on the facility side where you use water, not the PG25, because it's got a higher heat capacity than PG25, and it would be more helpful to place it there. You don't need that lot of the expensive PG25 if you place it on the other side of the CDU.
Yeah, I agree with that completely, and that's at the heart of that issue about how much of the load is actually liquid cooled, the load that goes to the plant, and the larger that load, the more easy it becomes to move that buffer tank out of the TCS loop, put it into the facility loop. And when you do that, it's a different metal, it's a different liquid, much easier to plan for it. For one thing, it doesn't have to be inside of the expensive data hall. It can be outside in the chiller yard. If you have air-cooled chillers, it can be in a mechanical room at the side of the building, and it can be much, much bigger. You don't care about square footage or space that it occupies. So there's no question about it. That is the transition we would like to get to. But at this point, with the initial deployments, we didn't have a choice but to put them into the TCS loop. And that's not my preference. It's just the reality with some configurations. But I agree with you completely. Move it out if there's an opportunity to do it.
We now have Luca on the line. And by the way, Luca's the one Vali referred to a paper. Yeah, so Luca, please.
Go for it, Luca. I really appreciate it, by the way. I know it was an outline form, but it was really impactful.
Thank you. I've been thinking about the sizing issue for quite some time, and my understanding is that you may need the tank, but you may not. And this is something that you can see doing the sizing math. What is from my point of view, what is the problem you want to solve? You want to let the control system be able to counteract the temperature increase. And in order to do that, you may think of having a perfect control system. Okay, it does not exist, but let's say we have it. But still we have latencies in the system. because the heat bubble gets created into the cluster, travels to the heat exchanger. At that moment, when it arrives to the heat exchanger, the control system must be able to react and cool the bubble. You have written that the TCS return pathway is part of the buffer, and I agree. But, for example, I think that the FCW, the shorter it is, the better, because it makes the latency of the cooling system shorter. If I have a long pipe to from the chillers or cooling towers, whatever, to the heat exchangers, this means that I have less time to react.
Right.
So basically, to the bare minimum, I need to have enough time from, let's get the worst case scenario. A system going from 0 to 100 in the cluster. And being at 0, also the cooling systems are idle. So they need to start up, okay? I need to balance the time it takes for the heat bubble to get to the heat exchanger with the time it takes to turn on the cooling system and let it bring its cool water to the heat exchanger. If you have enough pipes, you may not need a tank.
Right.
Except for the fact that the tank has this valuable pro of working as a low-pass filter, smoothing the shape of the heat front, which becomes a slower increase instead of a sudden step, as you described before. But in the end, I think that the tank, the math behind the tank is compare the time that it takes to go from the cluster to the heat exchanger with the time it takes to turn on the cooling system and bring its water to the heat exchanger.
Yeah, and it's clearly not a trivial pursuit to come up with these point items that need to be addressed when sizing that buffer tank. And it's a complicated series of design decisions that need to be made to get to that decision. Do I need a buffer tank? And if I do, how big is it? Where is the best place to put it? And I wanted to highlight the difference between sizing the thermal storage and sizing a buffer tank. With thermal storage, it's easy. You have, let's say, 1,000 gallons per minute, and you know that you can lose the chillers for 5 minutes. Well, 5,000 gallons, that's the size of my thermal storage minus whatever resident flow I have in the piping. That's easy. That's the way thermal storage has been done. And if there's any issue that I would like to convey out to the industry is to think about the complexity of determining that you need a buffer tank and how big that tank needs to be. So it's a much more involved decision that requires, even though it's a simpler device because it sits there passively. Well, the thermal storage tank is passive, but you still have to have the control to it to recharge it when you consumed the charge. So with a buffer tank, from the standpoint of design, it's like the simplest of all things. It's just the thermal mass. But the calculation of that size requires that you understand the performance of valves, chillers, and flows, and even the IT equipment. So it is a complex calculation that there's a lot of consideration that needs to go into it. And as I've gone out there to the industry saying, I need you to calculate the buffer tank, I've gotten a lot of cold stares and not a lot of responses because I think the industry is just coming to grips with it right now. It's going to be a reality. Yeah.
Vali, we have one more hand up. It's actually here. It's Peter Seto.
Okay.
So my question, Luca and Vali, is the physical properties of water and the other elements of the cooling system are not subject to scaling issues. You could make a model of any given ratio between time rate of change in the at the chip level or the node and the cooling system. Is there a limitation to using models to simplify the problem that you're describing?
Actually, it's exactly the point that I was trying to come to. So I suggested to a certain designer doing this for me, I suggested how to do this in the spreadsheet. And I think I scared them away, only because it seemed like there are a lot of loose ends that they would need to figure out to make a valid model. I think it's easiest to do it in a spreadsheet. You could do it, as thermal response, looking at every second or every 5 seconds. And you just keep adding load to a thermal mass as the flow continues out from the IT to the cooling plant. I would know how to do it. I have not set up that spreadsheet. I've done it with kind of thermal mass calculations for air, and even had a friend model the thermal storage of steel and concrete in a data hall to see how much that contributes to the thermal mass inside of a data hall for air. Now we're talking liquid, and we have to kind of re-look at how to do that modeling to make this whole process a lot easier.
Peter, my point of view is that, yes, it could matter if you want to model the power into temperature, as Vali said. But there is an alternative. Just measure the temperature of the liquid leaving the cluster. In that case, it makes no difference in what kind of mix of chemicals you are using. You are losing time because, of course, it's quicker to read the UPS's load than waiting for the bubble to be created. But for certain, it's more dependable to read the temperature right there where you need to cool the system. But in case if you want to have an earlier reaction, you should make a model that may not be that easy.
The one thing I wanted to point out is starting from a full load at the IT level, you've got the hottest possible water coming out of it. The plant has no problem with that. It's the rate of change leaving that IT rack that is the issue at the plant. It's the plant being able to keep up with that kind of very steep rise in incoming temperature. So the more, once you've addressed it, once the chillers are up and running and more or less tracking that kind of load, you can drop your load and pick it up again. Thermal mass just takes care of it. Like the buffer tank serves no purpose at that level. It's only that rate of change. So if you want to do some sort of anticipatory type of control loop, you would look at the outlet of the IT rack or inlet to the buffer tank if it's close to the IT rack in that same loop, and monitor the temperature going into the buffer or coming out of the IT and the temperature leaving the buffer tank. And if there's a significant difference between the two, that's the trigger to start ramping up the facility plant immediately, because the load is coming at that point, and it all depends on the residency time at that level.
Okay, we have got, we're over by 4 minutes, but Chris DePrater has his hand up, and I'd love the opportunity to hear Chris. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Yeah. Chris, are you there?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so sometimes we see over a 10-minute latency on the power spike and the temperature increase. Have you thought about implementing, power monitoring into staging to speed up that response? on all your equipment, your pumps, your chillers, cooling towers, in that area?
That's a great question. Yes, but from the control standpoint, it's harder to get the power monitoring data into like a BMS if the BMS is strictly on the mechanical side to be able to get the plant to respond. It's doable if you put your sensing elements just at the outlet of the racks or as close to the racks as you can. You may have a couple of seconds of resident time from when it comes off the chip to come off to the TCS return piping, maybe under 10 seconds. And you may still have a few minutes of additional time as it makes its way to the plant. So the simplicity of doing it with temperature sensors, and by the way, even though I'm talking about putting a temperature sensor at the inlet to the buffer and a temperature sensor to the outlet, we have other temperature sensors throughout the loop. And we have pressure sensors. We have a lot of sensing elements. So probably the most appropriate way is to do some discriminated control where you're looking for the highest value or the quickest rise in temperature anywhere in that loop. And that can become the trigger to do that. I'd have to talk to our controls guy and our electrical guy to really understand how we can incorporate the power monitoring to make control decisions on a mechanical infrastructure. It might give us a few seconds, 10 seconds. That makes a difference in the long term if it's a big issue. That's open-ended. I'd love to find out more about how that would happen.
All right.
Yeah, even a temperature reset as well, you know, and a temporary temperature reset you can imply also kind of to catch that heat bubble.
Yep.
All right. Looks like we've got a great birds of feather topic for SC.
Well, you know, I had lined up 3 subjects, but this I put this first because it's the most important one, most immediate one to me right now. So I will skip the other 2 because I wasn't expecting to get such great participation. So I really do appreciate that. And I don't know how much time there is, but
yeah, it's 0. We're way over.
We're good. Okay.
All right.
For another time. I'll reserve the other stuff for another time.
Okay. Thank you, Vali, and everybody else for participating. Sid, do you want to take over?
Yep. Thank you. Okay. Next up, thank you, Vali. Next up, we have an invited talk. This is much awaited talk by Johannes Kirnberger on the policies and technologies of sustainability and AI. Johannes is a policy advisor for AI and sustainability in the AI unit of the OECD Division of Science, Technology and Innovation, that's STI. He previously led the program on climate action and biodiversity preservation at Global Partnership on AI and the International Center of Expertise in Montreal on AI. He is a member of the UNEP expert group on digital tech for circular economy, where he co-developed a digital transformation roadmap for catalyzing digital technologies to accelerate a circular economy. As a guest lecturer at the Technical University of Munich, he teaches students on climate change and AI policy, and he holds a Bachelor of Science in Management from ESCP Business School, a Master of International Public Management from Sciences Polytechnic, and a Master in International Affairs, Energy and Environment from Columbia University. With that, Johannes, thanks again for joining. Over to you.
Thanks a lot. Can I share my screen, or are you going to do that?
You can share your screen.
Okay, perfect.
It is coming through.
Okay.
Well,
Can you?
it is the other screen, not the full screen that is coming through.
Yeah.
But yep, now that's right.
So thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm really impressed by the technical depth of the discussion. Since my background is much more in policy, governance, and environmental science, I'll focus on the policy side and on the to give you an insight into the policy discussion, how it relates to AI and sustainability. And I hope I'm not boring you with a short overview of the kind of technical side of the discussion, but I'll dig a bit deeper into the different AI policy initiatives that are going on, and how sustainability is slowly becoming more prominent in these discussions. I work, as I said before, in the AI unit of the OECD, and I'm responsible for AI policy related to sustainability. We look at different aspects of AI, from transparency, accountability, safety, risk, futures, and sustainability is one part of our mandate. The reason we're looking at sustainability is that a few years ago, the member states of the OECD and kind of the AI discussion was centered around the growing computation needs of AI. Since about a decade, it's been accelerating even more than before. We've always had an exponential increase, but in the last couple of years, we're really in that deep learning, large-scale model era. And these computational needs are triggering what we've seen also in the news, like not only in policy or in technical discussions, but we've seen a few headlines like the dirty secret of the generative AI race. There was a very prominent paper in 2019 saying that training a single AI model can emit as much carbon as 5 cars in their lifetime. There are some early policy discussions, for instance, the German energy efficiency law that has certain mandates for data centers. More recently, ChatGPT, a lot of questions about the water usage, and some projections about self-driving cars and their carbon emissions associated with the computational power. So in general, a lot of sustainability concerns, and that kind of prompted our team and then also the member countries to ask us to dig a bit deeper into that field. It relates very much to the OECD AI principles. So our work is centered around these 10 principles that were introduced in 2019, adopted by all OECD member states and by the G20 as well. So it covers a good part of the globe, and it's one of the first intergovernmental and international AI principles, and with the goal to promote a trustworthy AI ecosystem that benefits people and the planet. And the planet from the very beginning is part of the principles, most prominently in the first principle, inclusive growth, sustainable development, and well-being. And that's very much where all of our work on sustainability is anchored, in these value-based principles. And that's what our AI team does. That's where the work is based, and where we kind of have most of our activities in inclusive growth, human-centered AI, transparency, robustness, accountability, and then 5 principles for policymakers as well. So as I said, it has a very much a global reach. We in our policy discussions, we have our OECD countries, but then also the G20. So yeah, a good portion of the world to work with on these principles. This initial discussion led to the development of a report called Measuring the Environmental Impacts of AI Compute and Applications, which is pretty much, that was developed 2 years ago. We published it at COP27. And it's pretty much a stocktake review on the existing measurements and indicators on the environmental impacts of AI that exist. And we're kind of mapping out the different impacts and also measurement gaps with policy implications, which I'll come to in a second. First of all, and I think that's pretty obvious to everyone in this group, AI applications can enable a lot of sustainability solutions. Just very quickly, 3 examples. One is Destination Earth, which is a European Union project on building a digital twin of the Earth, which can then be used for environmental modeling, crisis forecasting, etc. The second is Climate Trace, which uses AI and satellite navigation to detect large sources of greenhouse gas emissions that can be used, for instance, to track methane leaks from oil and gas exploration. And the third one, which is probably not a surprise to anyone, can use AI to make computing itself more sustainable, for instance, from Google carbon-aware computing, where they shift the workloads depending on where renewable energy is available. That's all very prominent. I think when you Google AI and sustainability, that's also what comes up. At the same time, not all AI applications are green. You have a lot of kind of non-green, non-sustainable use cases, starting from using AI for oil and gas exploration and other resource extractions. We have a lot of AI use cases that make consumers consume more, kind of induce demand. And finally, all the resource consumption associated with running AI itself. All of that we put into a framework, which is not a new framework, but it builds on kind of existing standards, research in the area. There are different ways to look at environmental impacts. We usually look at direct and indirect impacts. Direct meaning the AI compute life cycle or compute resources life cycle, from production, transport to operations and end of life, and the associated environmental impacts kind of along that life cycle, from raw material extraction, assembly, manufacturing, through transport impacts. Then, of course, operations, we have energy, water, and the associated carbon footprint, up to end of life with collection, shipping, and ideally recycling. At the same time, you have much more kind of intangible, but potentially much bigger indirect environmental impacts through the application of AI. On the positive side, several beneficial sectoral applications, using AI for climate mitigation, adaptation, and for environmental modeling. On the negative side, harmful sectoral applications, also the problem of carbon leakage, and the impact on consumption patterns and rebound effects. And then if we want to go kind of one step further on systemic effects, just one example, if you think of AI being used to spread misinformation in social media, which ultimately affects government capacity to enact climate policies, then you have a very intangible but a very impactful kind of systemic level effects that all need to be considered when you talk about the environmental impacts of AI. Following from that framework, we identified 5 measurement gaps with policy implications on AI and sustainability. The most prominent one being that we need measurement standards for sustainable AI, combined with more data collection on the impacts of compute and applications. And the key problem that we face, and that we face since a couple of years, is that we have a big difficulty in separating AI-specific measurements from general purpose compute and from kind of data centers writ large. I'll come to that in a second. The fourth being that we need to consider environmental impacts beyond energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, and the need for more transparency and equity. On the point of kind of locating the AI-specific measurement, we are interested in, since the OECD is ultimately giving policy advice to member countries, we're interested in more of a top-down than a bottom-up approach. So when you look at the ICT sector on like the share of global greenhouse gas emissions, then that's probably fairly small, depending on who you ask, but between 1 to 3%. And then AI, of course, only a fraction of that entire ICT sector. Now you have 2 ways to try to attempt to measure that. You can go bottom up, kind of look at inference training, development, energy per run, the frequency of runs. What we're more interested in is the top down. So looking at national or global scale data centers, data transmission networks, distributed compute. So that's kind of where we focus our interest, and where we try to collect data in order to ultimately inform governments make policy decisions. On data centers and on having kind of a global approach, if data centers were a country, they would consume more electricity than many OECD countries. Again, the range is not entirely clear. That's from the IEEE from 2022, giving a range of 240 to 340 terawatt hours in 2022. And that share has been consistently growing, not as fast as data center workloads and kind of AI workloads in general, but it is growing. And at the same time, a lot of the electricity used by the data centers is lost as waste heat, which is a big untapped opportunity for data center operators and for countries if you combine it with district heating. And as I said before, the electricity use has been fairly flat from 2010 to 2020. mainly due to very large scale efficiency gains, the shift to hyperscalers. And most recently, there is kind of an uptick, an increase in electricity use. And the big questions that countries have, and that's also the reason why we try to look at AI specifically, is how long the efficiency improvements can ultimately limit energy growth from computation. Then the change in internet users, traffic, data center workloads has all been exponential. And with AI, there's a big fear or kind of a big assumption that AI in the last couple of years is driving a lot of these workloads. The question is how long it can keep data center energy use as still growing, but not exponentially growing like we've seen in the past couple of years. And the big question is in the last since the ChatGPT moment, since the generative AI hype, the big question is whether generative AI changes our analysis. Again, two sides. On the positive side, we've seen some new applications coming up. One of them is Chat Climate, which uses exclusively IPCC reports and then kind of makes them more accessible to a wider audience. So simply ask Chat Climate about any climate-related questions you may have. And the IPCC reports are famously hard to understand. So that's just one example of how it can be used for positive impacts. And when we look at the countries, we did a review of the recent G7 meeting, and 5 out of the G7 actually think that Gen AI has a large potential to help solve the climate crisis. That's kind of the big expectation of this new technology. At the same time, we already see some early indications that the energy use and the water use and the resource use of generative AI is quite significant. Microsoft, for instance, just last year had a 34 spike in water consumption. They have problems arriving at their climate goals that their climate targets for 2025, 2030. Of course, they still have these goals, but in the past 2 years, it's kind of going the opposite direction. Instead of bringing them down, their greenhouse gas emissions have spiked, the water use has spiked. And again, that's only a scenario, but in a world where you have millions of users using generative AI inference, then the attention could shift much from hardware manufacturing and model training to inference. All very early stage, all very speculative, and of course you have a lot of activity in kind of trying to make generative AI more energy efficient, which is probably gonna continue for the next couple of years. But the question is whether this exponential dynamic of generative AI can be kept down by, again, innovation in energy efficiency. The OECD, together with the IEA, has several recommendations following from that analysis. For policy makers, again, not very surprising, to improve data collection and data transparency, to enact policies to encourage efficiency, demand response, clean energy procurement. Again, that's not very surprising, and to support using waste heat from data centers. And then a lot of the recommendations go to the private sector to report on, not only on energy use, but on other sustainability data, commit to climate targets, purchase clean electricity, and reduce life cycle environmental impacts. That's very high level, but that comes out of the analysis of mainly from the IEA to track data center energy use. And I think a lot of these recommendations have been reflected today and probably in the past couple of years here in these workshops. Now I want to shift a bit to the policy discussion and how all of these insights are reflected in the current policy landscape. When you look at AI governance, AI policy initiatives, it's incredibly crowded and incredibly complex. We have the OECD with the Global Partnership on AI, the G20, the G7, the TTC. All of these initiatives are somewhat intertwined. They all try to work sometimes together, sometimes apart on AI governance, and can be really hard from the outside to understand all these different processes that go on. And when you look at AI regulatory policies, then in the past couple of years, it's been incredibly crowded, starting from around 2019 with first executives orders, the OECD principles, the start of the AI Act negotiations. And recently, in the last couple of years, has been really speeding up. In January 2023, the NIST risk management framework, and then just in the past year, we had the introduction of the AI Act, in the US, the executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy development of AI, the Bletchley Declaration on AI safety, and the G7 Hiroshima Summit. So a lot of different initiatives, different countries, intergovernmental organizations coming up with AI policy frameworks, concrete AI policies like the AI Act. And fortunately, environmental impacts are reflected in most of these policies. In the AI Act, it's specific objectives to develop KPIs and reference the SDGs in AI development, to develop it in a sustainable and environmentally friendly manner, and to also assess the long-term impacts and the application impacts. The G7 have a code of conduct to use AI to address the world's greatest challenges, like the climate crisis. In the executive order, there is a reference to catalyzing AI research for climate change, and also the Bletchley Declaration is concerned with AI for clean energy, biodiversity, climate, and the UN SDGs. So it's very much on the agenda, but to be fair, not very specific. That's all very high level and very unspecific. More recently, and a bit more in detail, the European Union wants to establish clear objectives and key performance indicators to assess and minimize the impact of AI systems on environmental sustainability. And the NIST risk management frameworks, again, asks for assessments and documentation, and especially to establish measurable baselines for sustainable AI systems. What I want to conclude with, not yet, just a quick word on how hard it is to measure the AI footprint. This publication that I referenced in the beginning about one AI model using as much CO2 as 5 cars over the lifetime, that was from 2019, which made a lot of headlines. And then about 2 years later, there was a response study from Google that used their actual numbers because the study had to rely on a bunch of averages. This study then showed that the execution time was overestimated by a factor 17,000, the cost by factor 50,000, the carbon emissions by factor 120,000. So in the end, they had a much more positive outlook on the carbon footprint of machine learning. In fact, they say that it will plateau and then shrink. Just to illustrate, in the first study, just wasn't necessarily wrong. It just had to deal with a lot of averages. Just to say that measuring it is highly complex, and there's a really obvious need for standardization of measurement, because you can also not talk about an AI system that's pretty that is much more complex than just an AI system. And very recently, and that's what I want to conclude with, and then also would like to get your questions and your insights on specifically on these 3 developments. There is at the ISO a working group on the environmental sustainability aspects of AI system. Very recently at the IEEE, there is they want to develop a standard for measurement of environmental impacts of AI. And Senelec, which is tasked with developing the standards for the AI Act, also has a dedicated work stream on environmental sustainable artificial intelligence. I think in all of these working groups, and we hope that we at the OECD can kind of coordinate and help not duplicate work, but to bring many of these initiatives together. They could really benefit from a lot of the members in this group, because from what I've seen in the past hour, there's a tremendous wealth of expertise in many of these aspects. So would be really interested in hearing the perspective of this group. And also after this workshop, please reach out to me if you're interested in any of these initiatives, because we're very much looped into many of these discussions, and would be great to have the expertise of this working group as well. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you, Johannes. While we address questions, could you please switch to the slide which showed all the different AI governance bodies and the Venn diagram on that.
Sure.
And Matthias, feel free to pose your question.
Yeah. Hi, Matthias Meinte from Oak Ridge National Lab. So we are very much a group of practitioners working in all the technical details of what you were actually presenting on. So, but we actually approach it from a bottom-up approach. We are engaging in several different standardizations. We have worked with ASHRAE, Power API, trying to influence how power measurement methodologies are shaped and so on. So how do we actually best engage with you or institutions which are shaping policy in general? And how do we enable you enabling us so that we can basically, get the work forward that we care about?
That's a great question, and that's a big reason why I'm here today, because this bridge doesn't always exist, and sometimes you have two different kind of isolated discussion in the policy space and in the technical space. I'd say mainly two avenues. So at the OECD, this AI being very fast-paced and very technical, we work in expert groups. So we have an expert group called AI Compute and Climate, where we very much rely on technical expertise to inform our work. That's a very kind of direct way of feeding into our work that works by invitation, but in general, experts express their interest in participating, and then that gives a very direct avenue into OECD. Also, the G7, the G20, GPI, they kind of all know each other, and they like, I'd say once you're in the bigger circle, then there's probably a lot of access to different policy initiatives. The other way is my last slides, the standardization measurements that have just kicked off in the past couple of weeks and month actually, because they're going to be the basis of policy on European level, on OECD level, also on state level. So I think, very concretely engaging with these standards and if of interest, engaging with our working groups, that would be kind of the two avenues that I would recommend for anyone who's interested from this group.
So since we also do we try to shape some of these standards where they don't exist, would we then send, once one of our efforts is completed, would we send a representative to inform you guys, or what would that look like?
That would be fantastic. I don't know how like centralized or decentralized this group is, but if there's kind of because that's always helpful for any policymakers, but it's like the higher you go, the better is if you have it a bit compressed and digestible. So if there's some form or way where you have where you can distill some of the insights of this group into a more digestible format, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, sometimes we are very much on the technical details, and then finding the right abstraction might be a challenging task. Thank you.
Any other questions for Johannes? Well, if not, that was a lot to digest.
I do have I wonder if there are if you are aware of the different AI workloads impact on energy, and if so, like, are they distributed differentially as well? This is pretty more of a technical than a policy question, but I wonder if you have any awareness of or detail on that. And what I mean by distributed, I mean in the data center. Like how are these big companies like Google, et cetera, and even like Tesla, right? How are they managing their AI workloads?
So your question kind of is very much at the center of our measurement problem. So, like as a short answer, we don't know, because actually a lot of the big companies, so NVIDIA and Google and Microsoft and co, they sit in our expert groups and especially on the compute side, but on the environmental side as well. But they treat it as we call it trade secret or kind of business secret, because it's very central to their operations. We don't know. We have some like very limited numbers on AI workloads kind of related to energy use. One of the only numbers we have is from Google. The estimate was about 20% of their energy use goes into AI workloads. But anything else, and we've tried a lot in the past couple of years, anything else is still classified, and that's the big problem we have when we try to, because we get asked this question a lot. We get asked why we want to have an AI dedicated measurement, which I think is like you can make a good case that you don't want to have a black box of data centers where you don't know which drivers and whether AI is kind of the exponential driver of data center workloads or not. But we can't really tell because we don't have the data available. And then the other big question is on just AI specific measurements, and what we're hearing a lot is that kind of AI dedicated data centers are going to be the way forward. It might be one way forward. Then it will be easier because you just have a dedicated AI system. And we also try to measure on proxies. We just take some of the recent NVIDIA servers that are used for AI and try to extrapolate that. But again, to your answer, we don't really know, unfortunately. But that's what we try to get to some of these numbers.
I have another question for the audience as well as for you. Would a proxy be looking at the number of cooling towers at their data center locations? A proxy for the density and intensity of their workloads.
Can you restate the question, please, Natalie?
Yeah, just trying, since they won't be forthcoming with the information, could we guess at the information by looking at their data centers, drone views or whatever, right? And look at the number of cooling towers. My thought is that the higher the number of cooling towers, the greater the compute density. And the more we could identify where they're actually doing high demand activity. Because, the problem with these guys is they're doing all kinds of computing, right? And AI is also a big term, right? There's a lot of workloads within AI.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the problem is that very often, also in the policy discussions, people just use it like in the same sentence. They use AI data centers, like they talk about AI in the next sentence, they talk about data centers, but they don't differentiate between the one being a fraction of the other. It's just all being put into it's being put into one article. You talk about the environmental impacts of AI, and the next second you talk about the entire ICT sector. So it's mixed a lot. And also within AI, as you said, it's not AI per se. That's not like a universal catchphrase. So there would be a lot of need for kind of differentiating between different types of workloads in data centers. The cooling tower idea I've never heard, but it sounds really interesting. If I'm not the technical expert, but if there's anyone who's building a cooling tower AI, that'd be interesting.
Matthias, you have your hand up?
Yeah, comment on that. That may highly depend on where you build it. But since you're in the policy space, actually having transparency laws for grid operators, that may actually be a more direct way.
That's a good idea. Good point, Matthias.
That's actually what we see as well.
Transparency for not just energy, but water too.
Yeah, yeah. We actually have our so we started the AI team, but this topic being also much broader than AI, we very quickly also came into telecommunications and into the grid operators as well, because it starts to become a grid questions with the big data center operators also moving into kind of energy procurement and energy generation, and then maybe ultimately also grid operation. So it becomes it quickly becomes much bigger than AI, and many of these questions are not AI specific, but more like ICT specific. So there's also value in just knowing the ICT impact or the data center impact. But we'd also, not only because we're the AI team, but we'd also like to dig a bit deeper, more in detail into the AI specific part.
Any more questions for Johannes?
I actually do have one more question. Sorry. Are you an active participant at all in OCP? And is this information, if you are, I'm wondering if OCP actually has, I know they have at least 3 working groups on sustainability, and whether that's a good source for this kind of information.
I'm not sure. I don't think so. But if you think that's useful, then I'd be happy to look into it.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I'll just talk to you offline and we can.
Yeah.
Yeah, OCP is Open Compute Project, a conglomeration of multiple companies driving open compute standards. Okay, any other final questions? If not, thank you so much, Johannes.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'll go very quickly to the last slide, if anyone wants to take note of that, because I think that's really where the standard development for sustainable AI is gonna be shaped from everything we can tell in the next couple of years. So yeah, if anyone's interested, please feel free to reach out to me, and I can connect you with these groups as well.
Yeah, thank you. This is helpful.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Final session, Natalie would like to give an overview of the working group and really some parting thoughts. So Natalie, would you like me to share the screen, or would you like to take over the screen share?
If you could share it, that would be great. Thank you, Sid.
Okay. Sharing screen now. Over to you.
Okay, so as always, I want to encourage you as the evangelist for the EE/HPC working group. I want to encourage everybody to join, engage, participate. Thank you so much for showing up today and yesterday. I think it was a great session, and thanks to Sid and Torsten and to all the members of the organizing committee. It's been really exciting and informative. Next slide. Okay, so I think all of you know this, but perhaps not. The EE/HPC working group, Energy Efficient High Performance Computing Working Group. Our logo is sustainably supporting science through committed community action. And our vision has been to curb environmental impact through increased energy efficiency in HPC. Recently, we have been broadening our focus beyond just energy efficiency to sustainability, and we're continuing on that trend. Next slide. So who are we? Yeah, I gave this talk, by the way, to the European Infrastructure Workshop in May, and when I did, we were 1,100 members. We're now 1,200 members from at least 35 countries. And we are volunteers. All of us are, just here because we think this is important, probably related to what we do. About half of us are from sites, supercomputing and HPC sites. 30% of us are from the vendor community, system integrators, liquid cooling vendors, and others. And 20% are from the academic community. What makes us so unique and is that we've married two silos, at least two silos, the facility people and the IT people, the HPC system people. And we provide really a forum for open communication and talking. You can see that reflected in the discussions that we've had. We started with in this workshop, we started with the talk on that Matthias led on end users, right? Very much squarely in the HPC system space. Today, Vali led a discussion on buffer tanks, right? But a lot of the same people participated. That's what's unique about the EE-HPC working group. It's a great opportunity for you to talk to your peers across silos. And it's totally free and open membership. There are no restrictions. Just let me know. Next slide. Okay, so what do we do? Not only do we host workshops and birds of feather and panel sessions and those kinds of things like you've just participated in, but we have working teams. And currently we have the teams that are shown on the left, a procurement considerations team, an operational data analytics team, a cooling controls team, a power measurement team, a power API team, and a very nascent TUE team. We also have an ongoing team that helps to clean up and improve our web presence. We've had a bunch of previously convened teams. We worked with ASHRAE on developing what we called the WX classifications for liquid cooling. We've written a liquid cooling commissioning guide. We've worked on liquid cooling specifications. We've done a liquid cooled how-to guide. We've been working on dashboards, grid integration, which is the electrical grid integration, energy and power aware job scheduling and resource management, and electrical distribution issues. And then we've brainstormed a whole bunch of teams as well. If anybody has any ideas for teams, we're always open. We have a leadership team that reviews teams before we create them. Essentially, what we're looking for, though, is a technical lead. So if you're interested in creating a lead, we'd need to have somebody who could drive it, who's got technical expertise and depth in that area. But we'd also need at least like 3 to 5 people who would be committed to participating and to delivering on some sort of output. So that's what we are at the real backbone of the EE-HPC working group are these teams. Next. Okay, so how can you participate? Visit our website, eehpcwg.llnl.gov. Join a team. So the easiest way to do that is email me and let me know that you're interested in a team, any particular team. And all those teams are listed, by the way, on the website, so you don't have to remember them from what I just told you. You can attend we have a bi-monthly general membership meeting, and the next one is August 13th. And then we have a sustainable state of the practice workshop with Cluster 2024. That's a conference. And that workshop is September 24th in Kobe, Japan. And you can bet that we'll be at SC24. We definitely have a booth. We have a workshop. We have a panel. And we'll be, fingers crossed, we will be hosting Birds of Feather. The Birds of Feather deadlines are due in July 5th. So we got to get moving fast on a lot of those. All right, last slide. Okay, so there's the details on the SOP workshop. The full papers are due. This is a paper workshop. It's not like this one that we've just had. This is our invited speaker workshop. But the SOP workshop is primarily a paper workshop. We solicit papers from the community at large and, you know, open ourselves, or rather open up to all sorts of ideas and research and practices. And, you know, we're pretty open in the kinds of papers. This is not just a research workshop. It's really more in the technology development area or best practices area, lessons learned area. We like case studies, and either in the generally in the HPC space, and more broadly in sustainability. So, you know, water usage, for instance, is very welcome here. But the full papers are due June 30th, and we'll have notification by July 23rd. And that's it. Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. One final, few final logistics here. But once again, shout out and thanks to the workshop committee for helping us drive this. Thank you very much, Natalie, for being a mentor to all of us throughout this session. And then presentations and slides and recordings will all be uploaded on the workshop website. And with that, thank you again, folks. This is the end.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
Silvia.
Thanks, everybody. See you soon.